increasingly batteries are being put forward as speed to power at the current lithium price, and even at $40 a kilogram, there is a strong argument for still using LFP over sodium ion.
Welcome back to Rockstock Channel. It is Wednesday, March 18th, and we're excited to have back on the program Iola Hughes, Head of Research at Benchmark Minerals Intelligence, who recently published a fresh 2026 electric vehicle and BESS outlook calling for 16.5% overall growth in battery demand in 2026 to more than 2 terawatt hours, following last year's stellar growth of 31%. Matt and Rodney are going to dive deep into the details underpinning this forecast in a minute. Matt and I attended the recent Benchmark event on the sidelines of PDAC in Toronto earlier this month, for which we published some interviews with John Pazzalacqua of First Phosphate, as well as Ken Brinsden of PMET and Lucas Dow of Alever Lithium. We'd encourage you to watch that video. I'm very much looking forward to and would encourage all of our viewers to join me in joining Iola and her colleagues at one of my favorite benchmark conferences of the year. June 9th to 10th is Giga USA in Washington, D.C., which over the past year has become ground zero for understanding the geopolitics and funding environment for many of the world's lithium and critical battery materials developers. Check out the show notes for a link for information and to register for this conference. Geopolitics and the great rotation into the halo investment thematic, heavy assets, low obsolescence, was the subject of my most recent Lithium-ion Bull newsletter published earlier this week entitled Mineral War and Peace. Note that we just refreshed the RK Equity website and would encourage all our viewers and listeners to visit rkequity.com and please register your email to receive directly future issues of the Lithium-ion Bull and other writings from Matt, Rodney, and me. And finally, a quick note from our sponsors. USCF's Sustainable Battery Metals Strategy Fund, ZSB, is designed to capture investment exposure to metals powering electrification such as lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, aluminum, and silver. To learn more, watch our recent episode with Kevin Baum and visit uscfinvestments.com. And Lithium Royalty Corp., which recently finalized its sale to Altius Minerals, a diversified royalty company based out of St. John's, Canada. Altius seeks to create value via a diversified royalty asset portfolio. LRC also recently acquired a 1.5% gross revenue royalty on the Goulamina project in Africa, owned and operated by Ganfeng Lithium. And with that, Iola, welcome back to Rockstock Channel. Thanks very much for sending us your recent 29-page EV and BESS Outlook deck, which sparked a number of questions. I'll let Matt and Rodney fire away.
Thanks for having me, Howard. Always great to be back on the channel, and look forward to the conversation today.
So, Iola, great to see you again. One of the criticisms I've seen on Benchmark's medium-term forecasts is that they seem quite conservative versus a number of other industry specialists for both EVs and BESS. So can you sort of give us the groundwork or the grounding for your thoughts on the medium-term development of the industry?
Yeah, sure. So I'm always interesting to hear kind of different takes on the forecast and see where ours comes out against others in the industry. We build up our forecast from kind of a bottom-up approach. So from the EV side, we're looking at a whole range of things from EV production at a model-by-model level. On the BESS side, we're looking at tracking individual projects and seeing how they kind of build out over the next few years. It's really a mixed bag. I think if we take the market overall in terms of battery demand for 2026, for the lithium-ion side, we're looking at 32%. Sorry, that was last year. We're looking at 17% growth in 2026. A bit of a mixed bag there. So the storage market, we're forecasting once again very strong growth, over 50% year-on-year increase. To over
and just in the storage market, because I know you do a lot of good work in the storage market, but you cite a lot installations. So on your forecast, are you covering installations or are you covering shipments? Because that could be a reason for the difference, because a lot of people are forecasting shipments.
Exactly. So we do both. Generally, our demand numbers that we put out will be based on installations. We essentially use kind of point of installation, and then for EVs we use EV sales registration, just as the kind of most universal demand signal across the board. We do track on the other end of things the cell production side of things as well, and that's where we do see a much higher number. So in 2025, we saw ESS production globally surpass 600 gigawatt hours. For 2026, we're looking at over 800 gigawatt hours, and that compares to demand figures of about 300 and just over 300 in 2025, and then about 500 in 2026. So there is a big differential there, and there are a number of reasons for it. One of the biggest ones is because of the time lags that we see between a cell being produced and a project actually coming online. And particularly as projects become more diverse around the globe, as projects get bigger, some of these time lags are becoming very extended. So we did a bit of a deep dive into some of these various time lags in certain locations and found examples, for example, in the Australian market, where you may be looking at as much as 24 months between a cell being produced and actually the system coming online, because you go through all sorts of different steps. This was an interesting example where you had a cell produced in China, which then went to California. This was before Shanghai set up its Megapack facility. From California, it then went to Australia, was then delivered to the site. In Australia, you have a very long testing cycle once the batteries are installed, where they're basically almost running test runs with the battery, making sure everything works properly. And that took us to 24 months. So that can really start to have quite big impacts when you're thinking about your kind of lithium supply demand models, because then you add on an extra 3, 4, 5 months to get back to actual lithium chemical demand, and it can throw those forecasts out of whack quite a bit.
Out of whack by quite a long way. And interestingly, we had that sort of issue at the beginning in the EV sector as well. So would you expect over time that sort of long period between production and installation might sort of draw back a little bit?
Yeah, generally that should be the case. In the Chinese market, we do see projects kind of doing that cell production to operational timeline as little as kind of 7 to 8 months. That's kind of your best case scenario. More diversified cell production, system production ultimately enables that. Even that one example in Australia, the fact that now Tesla has production capacity in China removes that very long step of going to California and then going back to Australia. It can just go direct. So that helps. In the US market, cell production coming online there is obviously going to be a big factor, removes the cell step from China. So generally timelines should come down. It doesn't really beat the fact of the testing cycles, which is quite different from what you'd see in the EV sector. So a project may be technically installed, but it won't actually be operational, which is the metric that we're kind of looking for to switch it on as demand.
Okay, that's really fascinating. Obviously, one of the issues that we're dealing with in the market at the moment is that inventories for BESS have blown out quite a long way. So it's a difficult question, particularly in such an immature market, but what do you think is sort of like going to be the sort of key level for BESS inventories in terms of days of consumption going forward? Do you think it's going to be closer to sort of 12 to 14 months? Obviously, you cited that example of 2 years. I mean, I think on my calculations, inventories are about sort of 14 to 16 months at the moment. So
yeah, I'd say definitely lower. There's certainly a lot of room for them to be lower. The situation at the moment is quite unique, where in the storage market, particularly in China, there is really a attitude of kind of fierce competition at the moment. Making it onto X, Y, and Z's top 10 ESS manufacturer list is kind of a stamp of honor, and so we almost see this kind of overproduction going on just to get that recognition. At the same time, we've also seen a lot of players offering incredibly cheap systems, below cost, in order to get recognition and to ultimately become a recognized player in the space. So that's quite a unique dynamic at the moment, and we've seen the Chinese government react to that. So we saw the anti-involution campaign launched at the end of 2025, which was essentially aiming to crack down on unfair competition, overcapacity, unrealistic production figures that were being seen. So I think there's that element of it, which that overcapacity issue may be tempered somewhat. Some of those smaller players maybe will disappear from the market, and then you've got a really kind of interesting couple of things that have happened since the start of the year, where you had the removal of the VAT export rebate for batteries, which our understanding was that a lot of cell manufacturers had essentially been using that as their margin. That was the way they were able to be profitable, was kind of taking that rebate on board. And then you've also got the impact of rising lithium prices. So you've got this kind of trifecta of movement in the market, which are all impacting the dynamics. The reaction from the cell manufacturers and the integrators at the moment has actually been that I think price movement that we're seeing is actually probably higher than the ratio of the lithium price within a system. So they're almost kind of taking advantage of this situation at the moment, as well as that pressure from the Chinese government to increase prices generally. So all of these things will start to come into play and impact those. But yeah, in terms of actual inventory figures, I think lower is definitely reasonable.
Okay, and I mean, you touched on that issue there of lower lithium, higher lithium prices. Sorry, Freudian slip there. And in your presentation, you talk about how falling prices for BESS have been driving greater deployments of BESS. What impact is that higher lithium price likely to have on the economics of BESS? And can you sort of give the listeners an idea about how the economics of BESS vary between China and maybe Europe and the US, i.e. the rest of the world, because I understand they're quite different.
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, when we think about a typical energy storage system, and work out how much is actually lithium, if we did that calculation at the kind of tail end of last year, it accounts for about 7% of the cost. Quite a crude calculation, but about 7% of the cost. If the lithium price doubles, that does have a material impact on the price of a system. But relative to how much systems have declined over the last 2 years, they've essentially more than halved. That sort of movement is very is manageable by the market. It's something they can stomach, and a lot of the projects that are being built today, they are being built because the economics are so much stronger than a few years ago, and that is still the case even if we see that kind of small upward movement because of lithium prices and cell prices coming through. So we are generally seeing that as not too much of a major impact to actual deployment figures. The economics kind of region to region do vary quite significantly. In China, for again, it also depends on the project size. So that's one thing to really note is, if you're building a gigawatt-hour scale project, the price is going to be much lower than if you're building, a 50 megawatt-hour project. So that really plays into it. In China, we're increasingly seeing incredibly, less than $100 per kilowatt-hour tenders. In the US market, it depends where you're sourcing from. If you're getting a fully Chinese system, you could be looking at kind of 120 to 130 kilowatt hours for that. But if you're sourcing a US made system, it could be closer to 200. In the US, you then have tax credits which come into play, which then play around with your economics completely. Tariffs are obviously a big impact. So it is slightly case by case in terms of the cost. And then how profitable the battery actually is will come down to really kind of localized electricity market dynamics. Batteries are used in a very different way in Texas versus California, and that will ultimately drive the profitability. I guess one thing just to mention at the moment is that, given the situation in the Middle East and rising oil prices, that has knock-on impacts for gas prices and general electricity prices. higher electricity prices ultimately means better profitability for batteries. So that's maybe another factor at play at the moment.
So the US is, as we discussed, quite a big market for BESS, but interesting to sort of understand where the US government sort of sees batteries. And it sort of seems to see batteries as an energy situation rather than other critical minerals, which sort of come under Department of Defense. Rhetoric has been quite negative on batteries over the course of 2025. Do you think that the US government's likely to get a little bit more behind batteries as it sort of sees them as being more impactful for the infrastructure side of things?
I think they already are. I think the narrative around batteries in the US is very positive at the moment. There has been a significant decoupling from the renewables story, in that batteries are now seen as key to energy security. They're key to data centers and being the leaders in AI. Um, Increasingly, batteries are kind of being put forward as speed to power. Giving these data centers access to the grid as quickly as possible. So the narrative is very positive. The fact that the tax credit for storage was maintained whilst solar and wind saw that come to an end was kind of set the precedent for how storage was going to be looked upon. So I think that the narrative is very strong. They have done well in kind of escaping, I guess, the renewables hit. I think recently as well, we've also seen maybe solar starting to become a little bit more favorable again. Certainly a bit in the narrative, because increasingly there's just an understanding that if you're looking to deploy anything quickly, solar and storage is a really good solution to get you up and running, and the cost as well. So there is significant solar manufacturing now in the US market. There is going to be significant battery manufacturing in the US market for storage specifically in the next few years. So we see them as playing a big part in the future of the US grid.
If I could just interject, Iola, it was really cold this winter here in New York and other areas. And I watch a lot of discourse, on X and listen to a lot of podcasts about, this debate, solar versus fossil fuels, but then affordability and electricity costs. So I opened up my electric bill, Jigger Shah said, like, people are going to open up their electric bill and be shocked at how high the prices are. And I'm shocked at how high the prices are. So it's become a political issue. And to the point of, I advertised your upcoming Giga USA, like in the lead up to the midterms. I mean, this is relevant. Like, so how did solar, and wind, perform this winter, right? When it was freezing cold, right? Like, so because that does support, because there's a lot of some people are saying it didn't perform very well, right? And also people are saying in the Iran war now that solar and wind are not necessarily picking up the slack for the lack of oil. So just from a political point of view, the the global thing, and then the kind of US, how is that landing?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's quite mixed. So, if you take like Texas, where you had the winter storm Fern, which was very cold, and that's somewhere where you do have a significant amount of batteries deployed on that grid, and the outcome there was a lot better than what was seen a few years ago under previous storms. My understanding is that was a mix of both the fossil fuel generators working better, but then also the batteries performing well and doing their job as well. There are stories of people who had residential battery units, really those coming into play as well. So I think there is definitely an understanding that batteries can come in those solutions, in those situations, and help provide a bit of a solution. I think more broadly with the conflict in the Middle East, the way that we're seeing maybe the impact on both solar and the battery side of things is, we can definitely draw parallels with what happened in Pakistan a few years ago when they had their energy crisis. We saw a huge amount of imports of solar panels from China. I think they became, the biggest receiver of solar panels globally in that one year. the way that we're seeing is, a lot of these markets, particularly Southeast Asia, are very reliant on oil from the Middle East. Potentially, this is the moment where, we'll see a kind of accelerated trigger, essentially a trigger to accelerate that transition to renewables, to batteries. And China's in a position right now where it can kind of sweep in. It has, excess capacity of both solar and batteries, and kind of serve these markets and help them, get some kind of energy security under alternatives to that Middle East oil. So there is a bit of an upside we're potentially hearing for some of these use cases. But I think, I guess what the other thing is just like in terms of whether solar and storage can meet all of the lack of oil right now. It's ultimately comes down to there's not been enough deployed yet that you can't just wean off oil straight away if the capacity has not been built out yet.
Iola, I hear different things on sodium ion. How is that technology coming along in the energy storage side, and is it competitive? I know the cycle life was pretty good. How is it doing on a cost and deployment basis?
Yeah, so we actually we did quite a big thought piece on this recently, which if anyone's interested in, can happy to share with them. Essentially looking at, on the back of the recent lithium price rally, what does this mean for sodium ion? It's the classic thing where as soon as the lithium price goes up, everyone gets excited about sodium ion again. So been quite a lot of interest in the first few months of this year. The kind of headline summary of what our analysis came out with was that, at the current lithium price, and even at kind of a $40 a kilogram price, there is a strong argument for still using LFP over sodium ion. Couple of reasons for that. So firstly, the cost on the sodium ion side at the moment, it has not come down, as significantly as would need to happen for it to be competitive. And then you have other things to consider. So, on the energy density side, it still is significantly lower than LFP. So that's really important when we think about, a large scale energy storage project. Say you are building a gigawatt hour project. To build an equivalent gigawatt hour project, LFP versus sodium ion, you would need significantly more systems to do that. You would need significantly more land to do that, cabling, all of these things that start to add into the actual project cost and bring you up. So it's not just a case of assessing it at the cell level, but you have to think about the project level as well. So that's one of the barriers that we're seeing at the moment as well. In terms of actual developments in the market, things are definitely progressing. We are seeing projects being deployed in China, generally quite small scale. In China's 15th five-year plan, they kind of highlighted sodium ion flow batteries. They want to promote these, particularly in certain regions. So they highlighted in Mongolia and the Gobi Desert, where you have extreme fluctuations in temperature, quite good places for them. And then the other thing that's quite interesting as well is in terms of actual pipeline cell production being built out for sodium ion, it's a really interesting picture. So at a kind of headline level, we have about 600 gigawatt hours in the pipeline announced for 2030 sodium ion capacity. Most of that is in China. And when you drill into where that capacity is actually coming from, only about 10% is from established cell manufacturers. So your CATLs, your BYDs. The rest of it is really from players that you won't have heard of before. This is the first time they're going to be doing sodium ion or doing battery production in general. So how many of those will actually come to fruition is a bit of a question mark at the moment.
So those forecasts, to excuse the pun, you take with a pinch of salt. So the other thing that I have been noticing, Iola, is the size of the form factor in energy storage is going up. I think we're over 1,000 now. Where are the limits to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So, people have announced 1,000 amp hour cells. I wouldn't say they're widely being deployed in the market at the moment. The industry standard is still the 314 amp hour. We are starting to see projects being deployed with 500 to 600 amp hour batteries. there does start to be limitations when you get to bigger and bigger cells. So people have suggested 1,000 could be a good place to stop. But yeah, it seems to be a bit of a moving target. I think a few years ago people would have been like, oh, 600, that's crazy. So it's a moving target. I think the thing that maybe starts to get more of an issue is around the kind of containers that we're seeing. So when you're packing more and more cells into a 20-foot container, it really starts to play into the weight of those. So when you have a very extremely heavy container, transportation can become a bit of an issue. So particularly in like Europe, where you have a lot of old bridges that can't support really heavy vehicles. Not so much for the US. There's kind of question marks around, will these containers actually be feasible from a logistics perspective as well?
And can I ask, sort of moving forward on that subject, I mean, one of the issues that's been a huge plus in BESS land over the last couple of years have been the improvements in sort of efficiency. I mean, how much energy and power you can pack into a 20-foot container, and a lot of that's been the larger form factors. How much more manufacturing efficiency do you think there is in BESS?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely a key thing. So we've seen these system price declines essentially, halving in a couple of years. A lot of the innovation has happened, and we do see it now as being a kind of more incremental process. People are working on all sorts of different things, and innovation in terms of like additives that you might add to the actual kind of cell formulation, which could help boost energy density. So yeah, a few different things that are being considered, but we see it as much more incremental at this stage.
Okay, so moving on to EVs, one of the thematics I saw in your slide deck is that you're looking for greater plug-in hybrid market share, so increasing market share in plug-in hybrids going forward, and indeed larger plug-in hybrid batteries, both of which I agree with. But for much of last year, plug-in hybrids actually lost market share. So what's your thinking behind sort of plug-in hybrid sort of reversing that trend from certainly the first half of 25?
Yeah, I mean a few different things. So we saw plug-in hybrid sales actually decline a bit in China last year. So part of the reason that was is how the trade-in subsidy was set up last year. So essentially the way that it was done is it was a flat amount of 20,000 RMB, and that really favored small BEVs, because if you think about some of the extreme cases, if you think about like a Wuling Mini, that subsidy amount would be over 50% of the vehicle. If you think about things like this, even like the Seagull, that's kind of over 35% of the vehicle. So the subsidies changed this year, so now it's just a flat 12. I think it's 12%. And what that means is that it starts to kind of shift the dynamics of what's the best option of a vehicle. We expect to see a kind of wider array of larger vehicles. Larger vehicles is where you see more plug-in hybrids. You don't really see those small segment A vehicles being plug-in hybrids. They're much more in the BEV category. So we expect that to play into it as a factor. And then, yeah, other markets as well, like, in the US, we're seeing an increased interest in plug-in hybrids, in range extenders. In Europe, we're also starting to see more interest there. There's been a very interesting kind of shift in the last few months in the European market, where the way that plug-in hybrids have historically been assessed in terms of their CO2 rating has been extremely favorable. It's completely unrealistic. The reality is that a lot of people are driving around these plug-in hybrids without plugging them in, and that their emissions are much higher than the rating they're given. So the EU is kind of addressing that and making adjustments to their emissions rating. And that's not great for these OEMs who have been selling plug-in hybrids to help them meet their fleet emission targets. So the reaction now to kind of ease that is to increase the pack size of plug-in hybrids, and that helps balance the kind of CO2 emission rating. So that's ultimately driving larger pack sizes as well. Also in China, we saw a change in rule where the range of a plug-in hybrid had to be over 100 kilometers. So again, increasing pack sizes there. And then range extenders even more so. We've seen a few announcements of range extenders in the US, and these vehicles have 100 kilowatt hour pack size, which in any other market is a very, very large BEV. So that's a big upside driver as well.
So that's the equivalent of an extended range electric vehicle.
Yeah, exactly.
Iola, your forecasts, just looking at your growth in battery demand for this year, it looks like quite a bit of a flattening out of EVs. Are you seeing China's EV penetration sort of taper off? And looking at the export numbers, it looks like that's how they're going to try and move the capacity that they've built up. But the export numbers for the first 2 months of this year were eye-watering. Is that going to continue? I mean, are the OEMs going to go out of business at this rate? Where we headed?
Yeah, so I mean, the first couple of months in the year of China are always a bit scary when we're looking at our forecasts. We get cold feet. We're like, oh, it's too high. So it is always a bit too early to tell. I think March is generally a good test bed. End of Chinese New Year. The first 2 months of the year were down 32%, which is obviously pretty negative. Which means that the global market for the first 2 months of the year is down 19% year on year. So very weak start.
Is the Chinese New Year, is that a Chinese New Year adjusted, or is that just a straight number?
No, so include, not adjusted. It has a bit of an impact. We can look at data from CPCA for the first 2 weeks of March. That is currently down 28% year on year. The reporting can be a little bit funny in that the month can start really weak and then it can improve throughout the year. So again, take that with a bit of a pinch of salt to see how the final numbers come out in March. But generally, things are not looking particularly positive so far. The change in subsidy being key to that, the introduction of the purchase tax being the other key element to that. What I would say generally is that in terms of penetration rate, it's not as bad. It's ultimately the total vehicle market which is taking a hit as well. So yeah, it's an overall kind of market suppression. The other thing to, I guess, factor in as well is, given the conflict in the Middle East and broader inflationary pressures that we are seeing, that could also play into a reduced outlook for both total vehicle market and the EV market over the next few months as well. So yeah, we're looking at 9% growth globally, but things could potentially get worse.
Yeah, look, it's always hard to forecast. Historically, oil over 100 has always led to a global recession. We haven't had one in quite some time, so that's going to play out. But I guess the flip side of that is, with China struggling to get oil through the strait, might that boost your EV demand numbers if this continues?
Yeah. You can look at it both ways, right? It's there's an argument that increasing energy prices, people will go, oh, EV isn't a good option. There is also an argument that electricity prices will also go up, and then also because of inflationary pressures, global recession, people will stop purchasing. So you can look at it from both angles, I think. The Middle East specifically, last year sold about 200,000 EVs. So we will likely see impact there. Israel is the biggest market there. They had about 90,000 vehicles sold last year. And they haven't been disrupted because of what was going on in Israel the last few years, but because a lot of those deliveries would typically go through the strait, that there is likely to be an impact to the EV market there, and then also BESS projects in the region will certainly have some sort of delays because all of those deliveries would go through the strait.
And Iola, your thoughts on the export market for this year coming out of China? I mean, I don't see how the OEMs can keep this up. The European, Western OEMs. So how does this all play out? How does this end?
Yeah, I mean,
for whom is it bad and badly?
yeah, I mean, China's been very aggressive on overseas exports. There's a lot of market to be had for to be taken by the Chinese players, and I think rest of world EV sales in the first 2 months of the year were up about 84%. So continuing to see very strong growth. Thailand was really strong in the start of the year. South Korea as well, really strong start to the year. Ultimately, there's going to be players who are not going to probably be around in a few years' time. Saying who is pretty hard to. I'm not in a position to say who at this point. In Europe, Chinese players are going to, it's not just going to be about exports, but it's also going to be Chinese brand manufacturing in the European market. So you've got, BYD bringing production on this year. There's speculation that, the UK may see an automaker coming through and, building Chinese EVs there. So yeah, Chinese players are going to be the kind of dominating force for the next few years, outside of the US anyway.
And Iola, what's the game plan for European OEMs? How do they? I know there's been a delay. You've put it in your slide deck in terms of deferring the benchmarks, but that's just kicking the can. What is the play for them? How do they get back in the game here?
Yeah, so the EU is trying to introduce some more kind of protectionist measures. They released the kind of draft of the Industrial Accelerator Act a few weeks ago, just before our event in Brussels, which was very timely and led a lot of the discussion there. That sets requirements around kind of manufacturing in the European Union. So that's something that we'll start to see more of, I think, in terms of the EU trying to protect a lot of these players. The other, I guess, option that we're seeing some OEMs pursue is partnering with the Chinese players. So we've recently seen Stellantis increase their collaboration with Leapmotor, and that's something that we might see more of, is trying to partner and enable to grow that way.
I guess my concern is if Chinese auto companies can set up shop in Europe and compete, then it doesn't leave much room, and then the margins at which they prepare to sell it. So we've seen some horrific earnings numbers come out of the big OEMs. So I guess that's the question: is there still an opportunity for OEMs to sell into the luxury end of it and still make a margin that it kind of cross subsidizes on the EV front?
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly something that some players will be pursuing. I think everyone is probably quite concerned about maintaining position. They've already lost so much of global market share, even by losing out within the Chinese market. That it's a challenge. In the US market, we're now seeing a lot of these players, putting out massive drawdowns against their EV investments, having to pivot plans, shift strategy. So it's it's a tough time to be a Western automaker, I think.
And just one more from me on this, Iola. So Tesla launched the robo taxi or whatever, and you've got Waymo. How is that going? I mean, I don't hear EVs out of Elon's mouth anymore. So is it making headway? Is that going to grow? Is that going to be a success? Is this the route to millions of EVs being deployed? Domestic EVs or not?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of the ambitious plans which have been set out by Tesla over the last few years around production goals, whether it be the cybercab or the robotaxi or even humanoid robots. A lot of them haven't come to fruition, so expect it to be slower than maybe plans that originally set out, and probably lower volumes than plans set out. There's definitely going to be a strong market for autonomy in the US, and yeah, who wins out on that is still a bit of a question mark around the different methodologies that they use to do the autonomous driving. Whether LiDAR is the way to go, whether the cameras is the way to go. I still think there's still not one clear winner there yet.
So your thoughts are it is going to scale. It is going to be a thing in the US.
Autonomous driving, yes. Whether that's the robotaxi, I think still up for debate.
So you've got LFP growing its market share outside China over the next couple of years. First question is that primarily due to Chinese exports, or is there going to be some sort of domestic growth of LFP battery installations?
Both, yeah. So, Chinese exports ultimately is going to drive things through in the near term. We see the kind of LFP market share today in the EV market specifically. In China it's close to 80%. In the European market it's like 10-12%, and then the US is about 3%. But then in the rest of the world it's kind of 60+%, and that's all really driven by Chinese exports. In the next few years we have quite a bit of LFP capacity coming online. So in the European market you've got CATL, CALB, BYD. There's various players who are going to be bringing online capacity. Even in the US market you obviously have this big pivot over to LFP. That's really focused on the energy storage market to start with. But down the line, it would make sense that we would start to see that going into the EV side as well.
Okay. And where do you expect those sort of cell manufacturers to source their cathode from? Are they going to be importing LFP from China? Or, I mean, I'm really not seeing anything in domestic LFP cathode manufacturing. There's a little bit in Morocco, I think, but that's kind of it.
Yeah, so that's the big challenge. So in terms of your options, you have Lopal, who is operating out of Indonesia. However, Chinese ownership or Chinese parent company who's in play there. They're in an interesting position where LG in the US is planning to procure from them and has said that they believe they'll still be eligible for the production tax credit, which has pretty strict requirements, which using a Chinese cathode would disqualify you from. That facility's ownership structure is, there's the Lopal parent company, then there's also the Indonesian government have a share, LG also took a stake. So maybe some ownership structure changes there could enable it to be eligible. And then you have Korea, so there's Echo Pro, LG Chem, a couple of other players who are bringing online. LNF is the other big one, bringing online LFP cathode manufacturing over the next couple of years. So that's expected to be the key ones. And then in the US itself, there are a handful of players, but still,
at the drawing board.
Yeah, right. Mitrachem got a significant amount of investment from the Japanese government, and also got some various government grants, so they could be in a good position. They're also partnering with LNF, so that's quite interesting. You've got Nano One in Canada, who a small scale right now, but if they got the right investment, could potentially ramp up. But yeah, these are all 2029, 2030 timelines.
Okay. And I mean, even if we were successful in sort of building our LFP supply chain in Europe and the US, how viable is it that it's going to be able to compete with the Chinese on costs? Because obviously they have a very developed supply chain, not only on LFP, but also on ternary. If we develop projects over here to be the source for LFP for nickel, cobalt, manganese, etc., do you think we'll be able to compete on cost with them ever?
Probably not. On costs at the surface level, the way that you then make it competitive is, via subsidy schemes that you have in place, via tax credits which favor domestic sales, and then also via tariffs, right? So you have the impact of increasing the cost of importing, but then also subsidizing those domestically made cells as well. And that's ultimately how we'll see it play out. Electricity prices, labor, it's never going to compete with China, right?
Okay, cool. And then the presentation was really interesting insofar as you had a forecast for humanoid robots, which is one of the first sort of forecasts I've actually seen in the market for humanoid robots. So can you talk us through a little bit on the basis for that forecast? And also the other thing that I found fascinating was the chemistry of the batteries, which was very focused towards high nickels. So if you could just sort of give us a little bit of an understanding of that, really quite interesting emerging market.
Yeah, it was an interesting one to look at. I think essentially the way that we were building it out is we wanted to take a bit of a survey of what everyone else was saying. We wanted to look at the ambition that's been set out by the various humanoid robot companies, and then we also looked at the potential for applications. So we were looking at, factory lines, what percentage of those could potentially be automated by humanoid robots, and that kind of got us to our long-term view, which we did it out to 2050 actually, and it does continue to accelerate quite quickly, kind of beyond 2040. We, in terms of the chemistry, we thought quite a diverse mix saw potential in there. The there's been suggestion that the 4680 cells from Tesla, they'd use them in their humanoid robots, so that's really favoring those kind of higher nickel chemistries. The kind of key KPIs that you're looking at for humanoid robots would be low weight batteries and also high power, so that favors these higher end density batteries, and potentially even things like solid state. It would show some of the kind of ideal characteristics that you might be looking for these robots.
Okay, fascinating. Well, yeah, really interesting take. And I think there's very few guys, really doing that sort of research in the market at the moment. So it was really nice to see someone actually put a number on it.
For all our viewers, Iola, you offered, your sodium report. I don't know if we can, if you're interested in this BESS and EV report, you could email me at rockstockchannel@rkequity.com. I can connect you to Iola to get that report. You referenced Pakistan earlier in this conversation, that they had some energy crisis, and then that resulted in a big, renewables boom. And that made me think of the Super Bowl, where they had Bad Bunny, it was an all Spanish halftime show. And, in podcasts I listened to, Jigger Shah was saying that, like, part of the performance, he was hanging on like a grid pole, which was referencing Puerto Rico also transitioned to renewables. So I'm just wondering if there's like the Middle East issue, it becomes a crisis, like these crises lead to more, BESS. So if you could just, I don't know what happened in Pakistan, if you could just talk about that dynamic.
Yeah, definitely. And another good example is the Ukraine conflict. So, in the European market, following the Ukraine conflict or the invasion in Ukraine, we saw electricity prices really kind of spike in the European market, and we saw a lot of interest in residential solar and storage. So yeah, it's another great example of it. You can look at the South African market, which is somewhere which repeatedly has blackouts, and we've seen really big spikes in installations of solar and storage. The Indian market, we have some colleagues in India, and they all have solar panels on their roofs and in their houses, because you'll be on a call with them and they only go black for a second, and then they come back to life because they switch over to their solar and storage system. So it's increasingly, I think, being seen as an alternative to provide you that kind of energy security, and having these sort of crises basically trigger that transition and accelerate that movement to look elsewhere.
Okay. And then linking back to something Rodney said, yeah, Elon's not talking so much about EVs, but the energy storage part of Tesla's business has been going very well. And we had an announcement this week, LG, which had a joint venture with GM. They bought GM out of that, but they've pivoted from EV to energy storage. And it was a $4.3 billion supply agreement, beginning for like 3 years, beginning 2027. But this was for like mega packs. And, so I'm just could you comment? And those are LFP batteries as well. Could you talk about that? Because, XAI, which is Elon's Grok, and AI business, is a gas powered plant, but it's very significantly supported by battery energy storage. And I'm hearing that the gas plus batteries is becoming a big thing, maybe not solar plus batteries, for the BESS market in the US. So if you could just comment on that as well.
Yeah, so I mean, Tesla has a significant amount of system manufacturing capacity in the US now. So they have 40 gigawatt hours in Lathrop in California, and then they also have a 50 gigawatt hour facility they're bringing online in Houston, and that Houston facility from 2027 will be using cells from LG. Ultimately, that's being driven by US policy. So in order for a project to qualify for the investment tax credit in the coming years, the cells and the components of the system will need to come from non-PFE, and there's also incentives if they're domestic too. So strong incentive for Tesla to be sourcing domestically. They are bringing some of their own cell capacity online as well. They have a 10 gigawatt hour facility which is due to come online. It was the end of last year, but probably some point this year. But compared to that 90 gigawatt hour capacity they have for systems, that's not enough. So they need to have multiple cell suppliers. It's likely they'll still use some Chinese cells. There's the ability to potentially kind of, if you're building a project, use a kind of mixture of Chinese cells and US made cells and ensure that a project is eligible for credits. But yeah, it's all part of this kind of transition that we're seeing in the US towards sourcing domestically for the storage market.
Okay, and then finally, just on the negative EV narrative, I noted that TD Cowen came out with a bit of a contrarian buy or a contrarian bullish on the EV sector, suggesting a lot of this may be priced in, but EV buyers or owners like myself, never go back 70 to 80%, loyalty. I only have one car, but I have two kids that are of driving age. I could get a second car. A lot of households in the US have two cars. So, they're arguing one ICE and one EV. And, and then GM, just announced the new Bolt with an LFP battery, and it was priced below $28,000, right? Like the lowest price EV as a starting price. So what do you think of that? And, analysis, and could you be more negative and they be right, and in what time frame?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was a really interesting read, and generally it's not that inconsistent with our outlook, I guess. 2026 is going to be a very hard year. We're already seeing down more than 30% in the first few months. Beyond 2026, we do see the market returning to growth, and all of those factors that are mentioned in the report, I think, are ultimately the ones that do enable this market to return to growth. Interestingly, like on the Bolt, for example, that's something that I think was seen as a strong growth potential for the market. But they brought it back, and now they've said it's only going to be for 2 years, and then they're going to discontinue it. So that's a bit of a shame, as this was the low cost EV coming through, and ultimately those volumes are not going to be enough to turn the tide. Some of their estimates around like the R2 were, I think, quite a lot more ambitious than maybe we were seeing the potential there. The cost is still relatively high. And one thing that I think we do definitely agree on is the range extender story. That's going to be one to keep an eye on, and because those pack sizes are very large, that does have quite a big influence on battery demand.
Okay, very good. I think they were fundamentally arguing it was more a 2027 story, not a 2026 story. So, but it's already almost the end of the first quarter, and markets are forward looking, and 2027 is closer than it appears, to use a side view mirror analogy of a car. Anyway, Thank you, Iola, very much for another detailed discussion, and look forward to seeing you in June in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot.